everyone. Welcome to the MLTI 2.0 series, Recipes for Project-Based Learning. My name is Tracy Williamson, and in this episode, I'm welcoming special guests, my fellow ambassadors and educators, Kate Meyer and Rob Dominic. Project-based learning is like running a restaurant, where your students are the business managers, architects, menu planners, waitstaff, and chefs, all working together as a team to deliver a delicious meal to customers in the end. In this series, we're talking about just a few of the many ways to bring project-based learning into your classroom, along with some educational technology tools you and your students can use to enhance the experience. This week's episode of Recipes for Project-Based Learning is all about student podcasting.
We're going to start a new project.
Teachers and their students have been doing projects since forever.
3, 2, 1.
More and more are doing project-based learning. So what's the difference?
That's a great question.
Let's start off by reviewing.
Projects are typically limited in scope and duration. They're a good way for students to work with content they've already learned.
Flip to the paper that says sundial.
In project-based learning, students learn through the project.
Interesting.
They address a real-world problem, a driving question, one that can't be Googled and has no single right answer.
We were talking about how can we prepare for Atlanta's change in weather.
Students have voice and choice in PBL, some input into how they'll answer the driving question.
Does anybody think they might have some ideas?
So they gain ownership of their learning.
So those questions led to our investigation.
They collaborate in a process of sustained inquiry, lasting more than a few days.
We've got a whole lot of work to do.
They reflect on their learning through discussions, formative assessments, and critiques of their peers' work.
We are going to take a look at one of your friends' work today.
And then revise their work based on those reflections.
Now the sheet.
Okay, there we go. We got it.
You can
The final product is shared with an audience beyond the classroom. Maybe that's professionals in a related field,
I appreciated how thoughtfully you responded.
or it could be the kids in the class next door. When students spend an hour exploring the 4 forces of flight by crafting a Mars lander out of paper, that's a project. When they spend a month simulating a Mars landing, analyzing the math and physics at work, and discussing their work with real aerospace engineers,
And it sounds like you've done a little bit of testing to see if that works.
Yeah.
that's project-based learning.
Capiche?
Research shows that rigorous PBL can result in higher engagement and deeper content knowledge.
You're rocking it. Keep it up, okay?
Learn more about project-based learning at edutopia.org.
Podcasts are basically talk radio shows with a series of episodes that you can listen to at your convenience. The word podcast is actually a combination of pod, as in iPod, a small device where you can store audio files to listen to on demand, and the word broadcast. Podcasts have been around a long time, but only in the last decade gained huge popularity with audiences. There are literally millions of podcasts that you can listen to, with more being produced every day. You can find podcasts on virtually any topic, from sports to mystery stories, book reviews, true crime, celebrity chit-chat, and so much more. With the evolution of accessible and user-friendly audio recording apps, it is very easy for anyone to create and produce a podcast. Podcasting projects in the classroom are a great way for students to collaborate, present information in a fun and creative way, and elevate their voices on important topics in the school and community.
So I got involved in podcasting with my students a few years ago. As an English teacher, I need to assess speaking and listening skills. And in my department, that was normally done in a roundtable discussion format. So in a graded discussion, and we would often do 4 or 5 of those over the course of a semester. But I had a group of students one year who really struggled with that format in terms of being able to use that for an assessment. I knew that they had really great things to say. And then as soon as we kind of got into that roundtable discussion format, they weren't really able to express themselves the way that I knew that they could. So I was looking for a way to assess my students' speaking and listening skills. And just kind of serendipitously, this was a group of podcast listeners. So they would come in the morning to class and talk about podcasts that they were listening to. I was not a podcast listener at that time. So they really got me interested in podcasts, really through the podcast lore. And so that was what they were all listening to. And so we kind of started all listening to podcasts together and then discussing them. And it was kind of this really nice community building moment. And then all of a sudden I realized we could do podcasts together and create and produce our own podcasts. And I could use those to assess speaking and listening skills.
So my background is in math. Most recently, I was a middle school math teacher. So I got to be honest that podcasting was quite often just something I was like, that's an ELA thing or it's a social studies thing. It didn't really see it fitting into the math class as much. But my view has drastically changed over the last few years as I've come to really explore podcasting, getting to know it better, and really identifying and appreciating the benefits that come from podcasting. So I think that in the math classroom, it can have a strong influence on student reflection about the content. So many times there's not enough conversation happening in the math class. And, as we know, the conversation can spark a lot of growth for students and let them really flesh out their thoughts and really engage with material.
Project-based learning is ongoing and begins with inquiry. When embarking on a podcast project with students, you'll want to first determine the end goal. Why are you creating a podcast series? What problem or issue are your students going to dig into, or what need will you be fulfilling in the school or community with your project? Will students be reporting on information learned, or interviewing school and community members, reporting on school news, or performing stories, poetry, and skits? There are so many options for student podcasting projects that tie directly to any content area standards. You and your students will want to explore plenty of age-appropriate podcasts to get an idea of the different styles so students can choose what works best for them. There are podcasts where one person speaks alone to deliver content. There are interview-style podcasts with 2 or more speakers discussing a topic. And there are storytelling podcasts that have a fun, theatrical feel to them.
You look at how podcasts are put together. That includes everything like intros and outros and transitions and how you use music underneath what it is that you're saying and how you conduct an interview and add that into your podcast and, how the whole thing needs to tell a story. We really spend about a week listening to podcasts together and dissecting how it is that we would create one.
I do recommend with podcasting that, you really outline a purpose for your podcast. You outline what type of podcast they're going to be doing, what's the category that they're going to be doing it, how they want to deliver the content, roundtable, interview style, a solo monologue type podcast, whatever that may be. Really be mindful about those pieces of it before you get started.
Project-based learning is student-driven and teacher-facilitated, so it's time to let your students take the reins. You want your students to have ownership of their role in the podcasting project and be invested in the end goal. Having students determine, assign, and define roles gives everyone a voice and choice in that process. Students can also decide if they want to work as one large group or in smaller groups, depending on how each episode will look.
I think 3 is the magic number. That's what I use in my classroom. Sometimes groups are like, we really need a 4th person and here's why, or we really want to do this with just 2 of us and here's why. So there's some wiggle room in there, but I think, 3 is the magic number for me. Because there is so much to do, I think 3 doesn't allow for students to necessarily hide because again, there's cover art and descriptions and scripting and all of these things that need doing. So I don't assign those roles. My students generally divvy them up amongst each other, or they decide to all work together on it. But I find that they decide what they want to do based on their strengths and their interests. And that's really what I want them to be highlighting anyway.
Students can then brainstorm segments that they want to work on. Will each episode have all one topic, or will there be multiple segments that are going to either repeat or vary by week? Some examples of recurring segments could be weekly book reports, a status of an ongoing research project, weekly interviews with teachers, and then varying segments could be reports on a school or community event, a special feature on a class project, or a special guest interview. Collaborative apps like Google Docs and Sheets, or apps that live in the cloud where students can all have access to work together like Jamboard or Padlet, are ideal for defining and assigning roles and brainstorming segments. The next step in your student podcasting project is to discover the educational technology tools that are going to work best for your students and the devices your school has. For iPads, GarageBand is going to be a great choice for students. For Chromebooks and Windows devices, Soundtrap is going to be ideal. Soundtrap is a collaborative app, so you and your students can all be working in the same audio project together. If your school has MacBooks, the ideal combination would be to record in a collaborative app like Soundtrap, then edit the final project in GarageBand. For high school students, Anchor by Spotify is an all-inclusive, very user-friendly app that is made specifically for podcasting. Anchor will even host your podcast series.
So I use the platform Anchor. It's a web-based platform. There's also an app, so my students mostly access it on their laptops, on their MacBooks, but they can also access it on iPads. And I do have students who put the app on their phones as well, because that allows them to go around the school and conduct interviews and record it right in the Anchor app as they're doing it, which makes it super easy to incorporate into the podcast. I use Anchor because it is really like record clips and then drag and drop them in the order, and Anchor stitches it all together. Students can add music and transitions, and then Anchor stitches it all together for them, so they end up with a podcast episode. There's almost no tech learning curve, which I really like. So we spend kind of 15 minutes looking at it together and talking about it, and then they are off and running. So not a huge learning curve in terms of tech. My students are very comfortable with it. It's that drag and drop that they're comfortable with. So they go pretty quickly.
In addition to recording software, your students will need microphones and a quiet space for good quality recordings. Background noises can be removed with volume controls in the audio app, but only to a certain extent. A microphone pop screen is going to be very helpful to eliminate unwanted mouth noises when speaking that most of the time you can't even hear until you listen back to the recording. There are tips and tricks in case you don't have a screen, like placing a finger lightly in front of your mouth while speaking. That should take care of those pesky popping P's too. Finally, your students need to wear wired headphones while recording. Bluetooth or wireless headphones can sometimes create a delay in the recording. Once your students have written and practiced their scripts, recorded and compiled all their segments, the last thing, and my personal favorite part of podcasting, is to amp it up with music and sound effects. Since there are no visuals to accompany an audio podcast, the music is how you tell the listener what to feel, and the sound effects create imagery. There are tons of lessons and videos on Foley artists that your students can dive into if they're interested. It's always fascinating to learn about how sound effects are created in movies and in radio shows, and students really enjoy trying out some Foley work themselves. There are also tons of free sound effects sites to explore that students can download to add to a podcast. Sound effects usually work best in a story or theatrical style podcast and should really be done with subtlety. It can be fun for students to make a sample with a purposeful amount of way too many sound effects just to discover how distracting it can be. There are many sites with free music to add to your podcast, or students can compose and record their own original music too. You can really elevate the entire final product just by adding the perfect music quietly in the background to achieve a particular mood for the listener. In project-based learning, the final product is shared with an audience beyond the classroom, which, in the case of podcasting, means publishing the episodes. You can simply create an audio file to share out via email or present to the school. Or for an even wider audience, share on the school's social media accounts. For the most impact, publish the episodes to a website so that listeners can access them anytime, as a podcast is meant to be. Then the website can be shared out to the school and community anytime. Students can use Google Slides to embed audio and even create cover art or designs to go along with the episodes. And if you're using Anchor by Spotify, the podcast can be hosted and accessed right on their site, which can be shared worldwide. Again, Anchor is only recommended to students ages 14 and above.
For the most part, depending on their audience, we kept it pretty small. It was going to be for class or grade-wise, so just kind of within our school area. So we would be able to post it on Google Sites, which it naturally went on to pretty easily. It had dedicated pages or sections for each group, and they would be able to post their podcast there. When I worked with the school in this position, the students didn't have access to be able to create Google Sites or edit them. So we had to call an audible, and students were able to post it on Google Slides at least. So that could be used in that way as well. You can insert audio into Google Slides and have groups on separate pages, and then they can create a whole background to it if they want. They can do an image with it as well as inserting their audio.
I use Betsy Potash's work. She has a podcast called Spark Creativity. It's specifically for ELA teachers, but she's got all sorts of incredible ideas that I think any teacher in any discipline can use. And she's got a great podcast episode about podcasting. And along with her podcast episodes, she always gives resources. So this bundle right here that you can get on Teachers Pay Teachers is the bundle that I use. So it's all the graphic organizers that walks them through the step-by-step of a podcast project. They all get published as Google Slides for my students. So my students are creating right in Google Slides. She also has videos that you can access and share with your students about how to create cover art on Canva, she uses Vocaroo to record her podcast, so episodes about that. And then, of course, you can always purchase her curriculum or her podcasting units as well. So just a little plug for Betsy, because I adore her work, and her work has transformed my classroom. And so this image here is an image from how we published our podcast. So we do publish them in Google Slides. So I create a Google slideshow of these blank templates, zap it out to all the students. And then when my student groups are done, they create this slide. So they get this little image of a cell phone, so they can pop in their cover art. This group drew their cover art. So they, I encouraged them to use Canva, but this group had a student in it who she just really loved to draw. So they were like, please draw our cover art. So she did. And you can see they've got 2 hyperlinks here for their podcast episodes. So those link right over to where they are published on the web. They have to write a show description together, and then they need to tell me what the next couple of episodes would be of their podcast. So we can kind of see how they're imagining the progression of their podcast playing out.
A student podcast project can hit many content area standards as the team works together towards that final end goal. The topic of the podcast itself doesn't have to be the only content area that can be assessed. For example, speaking, listening, and writing skills for ELA can be assessed. Students can analyze data from viewer outreach for math or science. Students can be assessed on creative problem solving in the visual and performing arts while creating and adding music and sounds. And a student podcasting project, just like all project-based learning, supports all of the main guiding principles while braiding educational technology in along the way. For more information on project-based learning, you can visit the interdisciplinary instruction page on the Maine Department of Education's website. If you're interested in learning more about student podcasting or would like to get a podcasting project going in your school, you can reach out to me at tracy.williamson@maine.gov or any of the MLTI 2.0 ambassadors by visiting our website as well. Special thanks to Kate and Rob for sharing their experience with podcasting, and thank you for listening. At the bottom of this video, you can find the link to the slide deck of resources shared, as well as a link to Kate Meyer's video on podcasting on the MLTI YouTube channel.
I really love podcasting. I will continue to do it until I find the next level up from podcasting, because it gives my students the space to have their voices heard, and it gives them the freedom to create. Not just consume content, but to create content, which is what I'm always aiming for. I want them to be creators of content. every single time I do this project with my students, they totally surprise me with their insights. I'm always happily surprised by their podcast. I highly encourage everybody to do podcasting with their students because you'll just be amazed by what it is that your students are creating.